My name's Katie. I'm currently a student at the University of Sussex, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the ways that Freud and his theories can be applied to Shakespeare's Hamlet. So I wanted to start with a bit about who Freud is. So Freud was argued to be the father of psychoanalysis. So he'd speak to people about their experiences and their problems, and he would analyse them, similarly to how English students analyse a text. So for example, water is often associated with birth for Freud. So if somebody mentioned in their dream, which was his main form of analysis, water, he would associate that with some form of birth or new beginning that patient might be anxious about. So he worked in the late 1800s / early 1900s. It's worth noting here that obviously that's post-Shakespeare. So while you can make connections between Hamlet and Freud, it's important to remember that Shakespeare didn't have these in mind when he was writing. So these theories were applied afterwards by critics who might have sort of recognised theories within Hamlet that Freud had posthumously come up with. So I wanted to start off by talking about a few of Freud's theories. Some of these you might be familiar with already, and there are plenty that crop up in other texts as well. But today I just wanted to talk to you about the ones that are most relevant to Hamlet, in my opinion anyway. So first of all is Freud's book, The Interpretation of Dreams. This one's not so much relevant to Hamlet, because this one basically founded the idea that your dream, you can analyse dreams in a similar way to the way you would analyse an English text. And these dreams can portray your unconscious thoughts and desires. Next is the Oedipus complex. So this one is actually quite important to Hamlet. And as I say, so while Shakespeare could have been influenced by Freud himself, the theory is taken from the story Oedipus Rex. So that was written before Shakespeare's time. We'll go into that a little bit more later on. Freud also developed theories of hysteria from his work as a psychoanalyst. So he would talk to his patients and attempt to find sort of patterns as to what their problems were. So often he dealt with patterns in madness, and obviously this is a really strong theme within Hamlet. Finally, Freud also produced the theory of penis envy. So again, this one isn't so much relevant to Hamlet, but it's quite a famous theory to know. So this one's kind of like a theory about how women, in a short description, become jealous of their male counterparts because they see themselves as missing the penis that the male counterparts have. So as I say, it's a bit less relevant to Hamlet, but it does demonstrate a lot about Freud's attitudes towards women. And this may also help you think about attitudes towards women in Shakespeare's time. So we in Sussex Writes also have another video about sort of the attitudes towards women in Shakespearean times. So if you don't know quite enough about that, you want to learn a little bit more, then we've got a video on that too. It's also worth noting at this point that a lot of scientists currently have discredited Freud's theories, so it's not something you need to be applying to your own day-to-day life. It's more about sort of, because Freud, when you read Freud's text, that's something you decided to do, you might notice that a lot of Freud's writing has his own personal bias. So as I've mentioned before, his attitudes towards women comes up quite a lot. But it's definitely worth exploring Freud's theories because it can help facilitate those multiple interpretations that are important not only to your exams, but also just in thinking about literature in general. As I mentioned, not all of these theories are applicable to Hamlet, so this presentation is just going to cover some of the more relevant points. So the main themes that I'm going to talk about in this presentation are going to explore madness, hysteria, and the Oedipus complex. So first of all, we're going to discuss madness and hysteria. So according to Freud, madness is a manifestation of pain or trauma. So when you're mad, there tends to be something sort of below the surface. which is expressed through madness. So for Hamlet, obviously this is seems to be true, because the catalyst of the plot is the death of King Hamlet, his father. He appears as a ghost to Hamlet, asking him for vengeance. Freud also believes that madness exposes the truth. He found that patients considered hysterical often spoke their true feelings. So again, this can be applied to Hamlet, because he expresses his feelings without really any consideration for especially the feelings of his mother and Ophelia, but also he doesn't really think about the consequences of what he's saying. So obviously that helps with his status as the prince. He's not really penalised for the things that he says, but that also comes with the fact that he's mad. People don't want to upset him. So one main concept to do with Hamlet's madness is the question of whether it is actually real or whether it's a feigned disposition. Ultimately, this isn't necessarily for the audience or us as English literature students to decide, though it does serve to demonstrate another main theme of the play, which is conflict. So throughout Hamlet, there is tension and uncertainty, both within Hamlet himself and also the state as well, so in sort of government and things. So obviously this uncertainty of Hamlet's madness further serves this conflict. This raises questions about whether Hamlet is using madness to facilitate revealing the truth of the murder. Another point on madness is that it's not just Hamlet who experiences it or its appearance. So near the end of the play, Ophelia also turns mad at the death of her father. So this shows a really strong comparison with how Hamlet deals with the death of his own father. They both are in similar situations. This also backs up the theory that Freud came up with that hysteria is brought on by trauma as well. So for Freud, hysteria was considered a feminine disease, which can be linked to the fact that Ophelia's madness is never called into question. You can also make links between Hamlet's own masculinity and femininity. So you can talk about stereotypes of gender in relation to Hamlet's sort of contrast between action and inaction. He's caught in a liminal space between these two possibilities of whether to kill Claudius or whether to spare him. And that can similarly be found between his gender identity as well. In some positions, he seems very masculine stereotypically, and in other positions, he may be seen as more feminine. Furthermore, in terms of Ophelia, a lot of the songs that she sings before her death also hold elements of truth in them. We don't have time to discuss all the various meanings, but it's definitely worth giving that a close read if you're interested in Ophelia, madness, truth. Any of those different themes are really interesting to explore through the songs, and also the flowers that she mentions too.
Storyblocks Audio.
So next we're going to talk about the Oedipus complex. So Oedipus Rex is a Greek myth which was written about around 430 BC. So in the story, Oedipus is fated to kill his father and bed his mother. They're the king and queen of Thebes. With this knowledge, his parents send him away in the hopes of avoiding his destiny. However, when he grows up, Oedipus, having not known his parents, unwittingly actually fulfills the prophecy. So when he and his mother realise, she kills herself while he blinds himself in shame. So some of the key themes worth mentioning in Oedipus include ideas of fate and free will, conflict of both individual and state, and blindness in both a literal and metaphorical sense. If this explanation is too quick for you, I really recommend something that my English teacher showed me in my A-levels, which is Vegetable Oedipus. It sounds a little bit strange, but it really explains the story well. It's in the sort of animated form with vegetables. Oedipus is a potato. So at this point, you may already be making connections between Oedipus and Hamlet, both the characters and the plays themselves. But I thought it was worth just sort of explaining this a little bit more in depth to help you get a clearer idea of the connections you can make when analysing. So firstly, both plays feature an oracle, so someone who is quite a famous figure in Greek mythology. So they essentially tell the protagonist their fate. Oftentimes the story will then mean that the protagonist tries anything they possibly can to avoid their fate, but still ends up fulfilling it. This is definitely true for both Hamlet and Oedipus. So the oracle acts as a sort of catalyst. For Hamlet, the oracle comes in the form of the protagonist's dead father. So King Hamlet appears as a ghost to his son, asking for vengeance, and that's what starts off the story, essentially. So knowing both their fates, both protagonists sort of aim to stray away from their destinies in both Oedipus and Hamlet, but only, like, both plays end up showing how these outcomes were inescapable. This also provokes questions of whether Hamlet ever truly actually had autonomy, ever had control over his actions. Again, this isn't necessarily something that we as an audience can decide, but rather something to think about. So does Hamlet actually have free will over his actions? So the second 2 points can be linked together by reflections within the two stories. So while the script doesn't demonstrate any romantic feelings between Hamlet and his mother, some film interpretations have chosen to go down that route to sort of push that Oedipus interpretation. Whether it's a romantic relationship or not, it's important to note that Hamlet is very protective over Gertrude, and in the scene where he confronts her in her bedroom, he often alludes to her sort of impurity by sleeping with another man. So he seems a little bit too interested in the celibacy of his mother. So this could just be because, you know, it's a little bit incestuous, the fact that she's gone from her husband to his brother, but it also could sort of lead to the idea of Oedipus. But again, this is interpretation, this isn't something that's set in stone. Part of Hamlet's protection, like protective feelings towards his mother, may also be due to the instructions of the ghost. So Hamlet actually feels more obligated to protect and preserve his mother rather than avenge his father through murdering his uncle. So again, you might think about sort of the different reasons as to why Hamlet doesn't kill Claudius. This Oedipus interpretation becomes even more complicated by Claudius, and he undertakes two different roles. So on the surface level, Claudius marrying Hamlet's mother places him clearly as the king, as well as a father figure to Hamlet. As a result, one would think that killing Claudius fits neatly into Hamlet's plan of killing his father and marrying his mother. However, Claudius also somewhat fulfills the role of Oedipus and, as a result, Hamlet. So by killing Hamlet's father and marrying his mother, he places Hamlet in a complicated position, wherein Claudius comes to represent Hamlet. By murdering his uncle, Hamlet is, in a way, murdering himself. So the conflict of Claudius's position in Hamlet's eyes may explain why he's in such a frozen state of wanting to enact vengeance. So to finish up, I just wanted to mention a few key scenes in which Freud's theories may be relevant. So this isn't to say that you can't mention Freud in other scenes and that he might not be applicable, but rather that these scenes are, in my opinion, the more relevant to the sort of the arguments that you might want to make. So in Act 1, Scene 5, the ghost appears to Hamlet for the first time, providing him with a prophecy that motivates the rest of the play. So we've already talked about the ghost appearing as an oracle, as a catalyst for the rest of the scene, or the rest of the play, really. So in this scene, Hamlet decides to feign an antic disposition. So as I say, while it's uncertain to say whether this madness is fake or real, it's not for the audience to decide. Rather, it's worth thinking about how this madness may affect his actions, and also sort of how it might affect the truth as well. From here, Act 2, Scene 2 links into this as the first time that Hamlet appears mad. Again, we're not sure whether this is the case or not, so it's really worth sort of looking at the language that he uses. While it seems nonsensical and a little bit difficult to analyse, it's a really good source of close reading for analysing the relationship between truth and madness. This is also where Hamlet decides to use the play within the play, in order to catch the conscience of the king. So this uses the play The Mousetrap to prove the truth of King Hamlet's death. Act 3, Scene 1 features Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy, which clearly encapsulates the theme of conflict. So to be or not to be, a really easy example to talk about how Hamlet has an inner conflict, which is demonstrated in his environment as well. Afterwards, he also speaks to Ophelia after the soliloquy. And again, this language here, although it seems quite difficult and a little bit absurd, is actually really rich in terms of analysis. In Act 3, Scene 4, Hamlet confronts Gertrude in her bedchambers. So as well as just the language and the sort of ideas, it's also really worth thinking about setting here. So the fact that Hamlet confronts Gertrude in her bedroom may really strongly emphasize the Oedipus interpretation. In this scene, he discusses the betrayal of his father, as well as her impurity and indecency at moving on so quickly to his uncle. So again, you might think about madness here, but this is probably more strongly associated with the Oedipus interpretation. So thinking about why Hamlet is so protective over his mother. Finally, Act 4, Scene 5 shows Ophelia's madness. So again, this is a really good place to talk about sort of attitudes towards women. So this serves as a scene which portrays both the treatment of women and people considered mad. So often the same thing. As I say, Freud often discussed hysteria as a feminine illness. This also shows a comparison between Ophelia and Hamlet's circumstances leading up to their madness. So if you wanted to argue that Hamlet is truly mad, Ophelia may help with this interpretation, because obviously she is more believably mad. And that might be something you want to think about as well, is whether Ophelia is mad or not, because it's not really something that's questioned as much as Hamlet. Here, as I say, the songs and the flowers are really interesting in portraying the truth in Ophelia's madness. Many actually argue that when Ophelia is mad, this is the only point where she is free in the play. So that's another really interesting interpretation to think about, depending on what you want to argue.